because of the popularity of Trump with so many Americans, I really worry about democracy in America. And that is why I thought it would be important to retell the story of my trip to Russia. And I'm doing it first with a group of my friends who were actually interested in seeing it. And then, if that works, maybe I'll even go on a listserv of librarians, which include people who I don't know, and just say, if anyone would like to listen, I'm going to tell this story. Going to Russia made me even more of a patriotic American than I already was. And to me, it really shows what it's like to live in a dictatorship as opposed to what it's like to live in democracy and how valuable democracy is. So, starting with that, when I was growing up, the Soviet Union was nicknamed the Iron Curtain because only certain high political officials were ever allowed out of the country. Anti Semitism was common, and identity cards listed Jews as Yevrei, um, showing that you're Jewish. But many people avoided anti Semitism by just disengaging with Judaism and with the Jewish community. So even though they had it on their identity card, it didn't really mean anything to them. But little by little, Jews began building up their communities. And Elie Wiesel visited Moscow in 1965. He went to the great synagogue there for the holiday of Simchat Torah and was surprised to find tens of thousands of people gathered together on the street outside the synagogue, singing and dancing to celebrate the holiday. He even wrote a book, The Jews of Silence, about it. And I'm going to put that in the chat group. Hold on, let me get to the chat. If anyone is interested. Stuart, I saw someone in the waiting room. You're not, you're not doing your thing. Okay, so anyway, after the Yom, did that get posted? Okay, after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, many Jews were starting to reconnect with their Jewish identity, and they wanted to move to Israel, the Jewish state. However, they couldn't simply buy a plane ticket, leave the Soviet Union, and fly to Israel. Instead, they had to apply for permission to leave from OVIR, which was a government agency that dealt with immigration. And in order to request permission to leave Russia, they actually needed an invitation, which was a formal letter from someone in Israel who claimed to be a relative and have family ties that agreed to support them when they financially arrived in the country. The only people allowed out of Russia at that time were either Jews who wanted to reunite with family or ethnic Germans who wanted to reunite with family in Germany. Now, after presenting a request to leave the Soviet Union, if permission was granted, whoever it was would be given a very limited amount of time in which to dispose of all their possessions, to say goodbye to friends and relatives who they would probably never see again, to pack up what they could take with them, and to try to sell or give away the rest. Although the tight timeline between the moment that permission to leave was granted and the time that the Jews had to be out was slim, many people would have been grateful for this opportunity. But instead, most people applying for permission to move to Israel were not fortunate, and permission was denied to them. Permission was denied to the majority of applicants, and once an application had been submitted and refused, the person was dubbed a refusenik. So once word spread that this person was not a good Soviet citizen, that they had actually applied for permission to leave the wonderful Soviet Union, everything changed for the worse. Refuseniks were ostracized by former friends and colleagues. They were often fired from lucrative jobs as skilled professionals and could only find employment as security guards or elevator operators. They were subject sometimes to surveillance and violence. These people who had applied for permission to leave but had been denied were harassed, belittled, and sometimes incarcerated in prisons and in mental institutions. All of this simply for the crime of wanting to leave Russia and move to Israel. So at that time, it didn't stop them from wanting to leave. Instead, they formed a movement of refuseniks, and it consisted of having Hebrew classes in people's homes, celebrating Jewish holidays, albeit mostly in secret, and a thirst for knowledge about anything that was Jewish or Israeli. When I was a high school student, I was involved in Young Judea, a Zionist youth movement, and I learned about the plight of refuseniks. I used to go yearly to Save Soviet Jewry rallies, and I actually have a picture here of in New York, this was one of those rallies. We would go to the UN Plaza and we would chant things like 1, 2, 3, 4, open up the iron door. 5, 6, 7, 8, let my people emigrate. And at my youth movement meetings, we would also sometimes call the Soviet embassy, collect calls, and then we'd say to them, uh, we'd say, we'd shout out onto the phone, let my people go. So I was very aware of what was going on. We even had bracelets we would wear that had the name of certain refuseniks. And the idea was we would never take off the bracelets until those people were allowed to leave the Soviet Union. So when I got to Russia, when I got to Brandeis, a fellow student named Beth Huppin went to Russia for Simchat Torah. She brought her guitar and she had the privilege of singing and playing for the crowd that now gathered yearly outside of the Moscow synagogue. When she returned to Brandeis, she presented a slideshow about her trip and I was captivated. My mother used to tell stories to my sister and I about our relatives in Russia. Her mother had actually been born in Russia and knew people who'd experienced pogroms. In fact, as she was growing up, Russian immigrants to the United States would come to their house, and my mother would hear them talking in Russian with her mother and crying about what happened to them when the Cossacks attacked Jewish communities there, killing and raping indiscriminately. Although my mother hated anti-Semitism, she also told us that Russia had been a good place to the Jews. She had a relative who had received an Iron Cross from the Tsar for arranging burial of Jewish soldiers. And she had other happy stories about our family roots in Russia. I actually studied Russian for 3 years in high school, but and my father actually held the Communist Party in high esteem. So I knew things in Russia were bad. I'd read all these stories about refuseniks being harassed. So here's a slide of another place. There were lots of newsletters and stuff. There was also an organization called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry that would publish stories of what was going on there. So I heard that Beth's trip had been funded by an anonymous philanthropist. And after hearing her story, I decided that I also wanted to go to the Soviet Union. And I understood that pairs of people, 2 at a time, were being sent to Russia. So I let all my friends know that I wanted to go. A year later, in 1981, my friend Polly got a phone call from someone inviting her to bring a friend to an interview about visiting refuseniks. I never asked who was funding us. But we went to meet with this guy who happened to have an Israeli accent in a hotel in the airport, and we passed the interview. We were told we were going to be going to Russia, and so we started preparing for our upcoming trip. Polly and I wanted to bring inspiration to the refuseniks by bringing them moral support, finding out what they needed, and communicating those needs to student groups here in the US. And we also wanted to give them hope just by letting them know that they hadn't been forgotten and that we plan to give material support. Because back then it was really hard to do international phone calls. We had no Zoom. We didn't have Facebook or anything like that. So to prepare for our trip, we arranged a few meetings with other people, mostly other Brandeis students who had either already gone to the Soviet Union or who, like us, were planning on going. We sat down and we heard what kind of problems people encountered, and we made lists of things to bring with us. And we also tried to plan in advance for different scenarios. So one thing I did after my trip, I made this big scrapbook of things. And so I have a few things that are in the scrapbook that I can actually share with you. So this is our list. What do I do if? What do you do if you're followed by the KGB? Don't play games with them. Ignore them. Don't try to lose them. Don't be intimidated by them. What do you do if you're approached by someone in public who says he's Jewish? I don't know. Can you guys read this on your own, or is it kind of blurry? All right, I'll just read it. Play naive Jewish American tourist. Do not offer to help him or her or encourage him to leave. You can take his name, and if he insists you really don't know much about these things, nor what to do with his name, ask to see his passport at some point in the conversation if you can. If it's at a synagogue, watch for the reactions of others and observe how they look at you and your Jewish friend. So, because you always wonder, is it really someone Jewish or is it a KGB plant who's trying to get you in trouble? And if you think the guy is legit, try to find out what he wants, but play it cautious. So we went through all of these different scenarios. And then we also talked about what kinds of things we should bring in. We knew that people wanted to learn Hebrew, so we asked our friends to either give us books or to donate money so we could buy Hebrew books to bring. We didn't bring in any texts in Russian. We did get Hebrew reading materials. We did not bring Jewish calendars, but we did bring a lot of cassette tapes, mostly blank ones for them to teach Hebrew. And then we also heard that you can bribe people real easily with cigarettes. So we brought a lot of cigarettes with us, even though neither of us were smokers. Our unnamed sponsor also gave us a list of names and addresses to memorize. And those people were the people we were supposed to visit. I later found out that the person behind all this was an Israeli kibbutznik named Aryeh Kroll. He had family in Israel who we used to visit. And then when the Iron Curtain came up, he was no longer allowed in. And he realized that tourists were still being allowed in. And college students, especially American college students, but actually Stewart also took the same kind of trip from England, the college students were still being admitted. So he came up with the brilliant idea to raise fund and send students there as tourists so they could keep up a connection with the Jewish families. And in fact, Aryeh Kroll has now passed away, but he won the Israel Prize much, much later in recognition of all the wonderful things that he had done. One of the people whose names Aryeh gave us was Yehudit Nepomniachtchi. She was living in Odessa. She was a young 16-year-old girl. And Odessa, I had learned, was a center of Jewish knowledge. I think it was called the Jerusalem of that area. And now there was no Jewish learning whatsoever, except for what this 16-year-old girl knew by going to classes in Moscow and then came back and retaught it. So for her, we wanted to be there for Passover. We packed matzah. We had a tape recorder and 25 blank cassettes. And I also, in addition to that, I brought Israeli folk dance music so I could teach dances to some of the informal groups growing up in Moscow. Polly brought a camera to bring with her to give to financial struggling families to sell. And we did bring lots of Hebrew books, as well as kosher cheese and matzah. We each brought a copy of the New York Times and photo albums of family and friends in Israel. Before our trip, I stocked up on kosher cheese and matzah, and Polly and I did memorize the names of all these people. So then about 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave, I got in the mail my visa and my tickets to go to Russia. So I hadn't actually met with the travel agent. It just arrived in the mail. And in fact, the envelope was scotch taped shut. Was a little weird because that probably meant someone had opened it and looked at it and then sent it to me. We were scheduled to go to Moscow, Odessa, Vinnytsia, Kishinev, and Leningrad. So Polly and I flew Lufthansa to Moscow via Frankfurt. And before the plane landed, we were given forms to fill out in customs. Visitors flying into the U.S. are given these forms, whether or not they have any agricultural products. They're asked in order to avoid inadvertently bringing in bacteria or bugs. But the Russian forms asked if we were bringing in any printed materials. One way that the Soviet government kept their citizens compliant was by controlling information. Thus, unapproved printed information was considered contraband. And it's funny, back then, the only copy machines were only available in government offices, and computers were only available to Communist Party officials. There was only one newspaper, Pravda, the government-sponsored one. And because the Russian government was so afraid of giving people access to information, although computers and digital cash registers were available, merchants and even people in the airports still used an abacus to determine the prices and to add numbers. So thus, it was not surprising that we were asked to list what printed items we had. And we conveniently forgot all about the New York Times and the Hebrew books. When we got to the Moscow airport, we were the only Americans, along with a group of West German businessmen. The men were all way through customs, but as soon as Polly stepped up in the line, the officials made her open up her suitcase and started going through it. They found the matzah and asked, "What's this?" Polly answered, "It's matzah. I'm Jewish. The holiday of Passover is coming up, and I need matzah to eat." Then they pulled out a book she had brought of the biblical story of Ruth, and they asked her what it was. "It's a love story," she said, but they confiscated it. They also confiscated her copy of the New York Times and of all the English magazines they had found. When they got to my suitcase, they started going through everything, and I was afraid they would find the Hebrew books at the bottom, which was contraband for sure. So the officer pulled out, I had brought a wooden recorder with me that was made out of olive wood and said on the bottom, "Made in Israel." He held it up and said, "What's this?" And I didn't want him to see the "Made in Israel" tag on the back. So I said, "It's a recorder." And I grabbed it from him. I said, "I'm a musician here. I need to practice." And I started playing Debka Rafiach. That's an Israeli folk dance. The whole airport got quiet, and all you could hear was my terrible rendering of Debka Rafiach. I think the officer was embarrassed because as soon as I was finished, he grabbed the recorder out of my hand, said, "That's enough," threw it back in the suitcase, closed it, and that was the end of my search. This was great because he never found the copy of the New York Times or of the Hebrew books I had inside. I reunited with Polly, who was waiting me outside of customs, and we took a taxi to our first hotel. Our trip started in Moscow and then took us to those other places I showed you. Now, in each hotel, there was a floor lady who sat on the floor, every floor right outside the elevators. You could only get the key to your room if you handed your passports to the floor lady. And we had been warned that our hotel rooms would be bugged. So instead of talking to each other about any of our plans, we wrote notes with water-soluble magic marker and then put the pieces in a glass of water or flushed them down the toilet. We were also told not to use any telephones. So we knew who we were going to go visit first. It was a young woman named Natasha who was a Hebrew teacher. And we were kind of weirded out, like, how do you go to these people's houses who you don't know and just simply knock on their door? It was just a very strange feeling, but we decided to try it, and so we did. And we were met with the warmest welcome. This is Natasha in the middle, and those are her two students on either side. Oh, and everywhere we went, we were greeted warmly. These Refuseniks, who had never met us before in their lives, just welcomed us into their homes and into their lives. They shared story with us and what other food and drink they could. A lot of them made wine out of raisins. They assured us that by coming, we had renewed their inspiration and we were doing a really good deed by being in the Soviet Union. And we had actually no problem. We went around in Moscow. We met a number of people without any problems at all. And so we weren't going to expect any problems for Odessa. And there's a picture of Polly. That's my friend Polly Akunyev in front of Red Square. So we got on the Aeroflot plane, which is the Russian state-owned plane, and we flew to Odessa. Now, from there, Polly and I went to our hotel, the Chornaya Morya. And that means the Black Sea. When we unpacked in our room, we learned that our cautiousness about rooms being bugged was not unwarranted. I saw a radio on the dresser, and it only had an on-off button and a channel dial. I turned it on, and some nice classical music was playing. Polly asked, "Can you turn that up?" And I said, "No, there's no volume button." And suddenly, the volume increased. So we started walking around Odessa a bit, but we were really anxious to meet Yehudit. So we gave Yehudit the driver's address, Prospect Gagarina, 16/4/5, and he drove there. She lived in a complex with a number of apartments surrounding a courtyard. And in order to get there, you had to first enter the courtyard. And from there, all of the entrances to the apartments were facing the courtyard. So we decided that Polly was going to wait in the taxi because it was really far from our hotel and we didn't want to get stranded there if Yehudit wasn't home, and I would go in first. So I took my bag and I walked into the courtyard. I saw that there were these guys sitting on a bench in the middle of the courtyard, but I ignored them and I started looking for the right entryway. But there were no numbers above the entryways. So I had to look very carefully. And finally, I guessed which one was Yehudit's apartment and I went in. But As I entered her building, the guys followed me. And before I even had a chance to go up the stairs, one of them slapped me across the face so that my glasses went flying across the floor. And another guy pushed me down. And then the third one started throwing punches at me. I was wearing a thick down jacket, though, and I think their intention was to scare me rather than harm me because their punches didn't really hit me, it only hit the jacket. But I was terrified. So I bent down to protect my face from it getting hit again, and I started crying. And at that moment, one of the men grabbed the strap on my shoulder bag and he ripped it, and they all started running off with my bag in tow. I was crying and I didn't know what to do. So I felt around on the floor until I found my glasses, and luckily they weren't broken. So I put them back on and I walked back to the car. The driver saw me coming with these tears streaming down my face, and he noticed these men running with my bag to the car parked right in front of him. And he pointed out to Polly that it was a white car with the license plate 2599. The men got into the car and drove off. Well, I was too scared to return to the hotel, and I figured the guys had already gone. So I asked Polly and the taxi driver to accompany back into the courtyard and up to Yehudit's house. And that's when I took out the cigarettes that I had brought in case I needed to bribe someone. The driver was very happy to oblige. So he walked with us. We linked arms with him and walked up and knocked on Yehudit's door, and were so relieved when she answered it. She welcomed us warmly and ushered us in. I told her, I came and there were these men in the courtyard who punched me and stole my bag. And she said, I saw those KGB men waiting out in the courtyard all day long. I guess they knew you were coming. And yeah, I guess they did know I was coming. She was familiar with them because she was subject to their harassment. And she also told us that a white car with a license plate 2599 was the official KGB car of Odessa. Then I continued, I'm really sorry, Yehudit. I had in my bag a tape recorder and 25 blank cassette tapes just for you so you could teach Hebrew. And she said, but did you have any Hebrew books in the bag? And I said, no, Polly had all the books and she was waiting in the taxi. So the books are right here. And Yehudit said, good, that's what's most important. So during our visit, I have a little screen here. Let's see. So there's Yehudit's address. And wrong picture. Sorry. Did I show you the right picture? No. When we got back home, we wrote a trip report. And so a lot of these pictures, and I took things and put them in this binder. So these come from that binder, and behind it is our trip report. So, let me hide this slide for a minute. During our visit, I was really impressed by the dedication that Yehudit had for learning Hebrew herself and teaching it to others. She was full of questions for us about Hebrew and about Judaism and about Israel, and she pumped Polly and I for information. Her father had actually studied Hebrew once as a boy and had passed on to her all that he knew, so she was always searching for more and more information. Like most families who'd applied for permission to go to Israel, the Nepomnishis had lost their jobs and were struggling economically. I don't know if it was a result of low income or just a lack of toilet paper in the Soviet Union, but in their home and in that of most of the Refuseniks, there was no toilet paper. Instead, the propaganda books given out by the Soviet leaders, which were free, were kept in the bathroom. And whenever you needed toilet paper, you just rip a page out of those propaganda books. Although the matzah we brought had been lost when my bag was stolen, in addition to the Hebrew books, I had brought one round chunk of Miller's kosher Gouda cheese in that red wax covering, and we were able to give that to Yehudit. She had never seen cheese labeled kosher before, and she was delighted. After spending a few hours with Yehudit, Polly and I decided it was time to return to the hotel. But Yehudit invited us to return back in a few nights for the Seder, and she told us a number of her students would be there. Now, I didn't ever want to go back there again, but Polly readily agreed on behalf of both of us, so our plans were set. For the next few days, in order to avoid any drama, Polly and I didn't visit any Refuseniks. We were just tourists in Odessa. We actually saw the Potemkin Stairs. If anyone has ever seen, there's a famous movie with the Potemkin Stairs. And we were followed everywhere and had some funny experiences. At one point in our hotel, I recognized in the elevator the guys who had stolen my bag, but I pretended not to recognize them and they pretended not to recognize me. So we were all fine. Another time we went to visit an observatory, and the lady behind the counter sold us tickets. But then she told us in Russia that the observatory was closed and not opening for another 2 hours. Now, even though I studied Russia for 3 years in high school, my Russian was terrible. My Russian was terrible, and I pretended I didn't know anything. So I pretended I didn't understand her, and we sat down to wait. And the guys who were following us came in and they bought tickets and they sat down to wait. And they're waiting and waiting and looking at their clock. And they went to talk to the lady, and she tells them it doesn't open in until another 2 hours. So one of our tails comes up to me, lifts up my arm and points to my watch and points to the number. And I say, "Oh, it doesn't open until 2 o'clock." And he nods and said, "Yes." I said, "Oh, okay, thank you." So Polly and I get up and leave, and then they get up and follow us out. So that was pretty funny. Um, During the afternoon preceding the first night of Passover, Polly and I prepared ourselves mentally and physically for going back to Yehudit's apartment. This time I pre-wrote her address on a piece of paper in Russian, along with a request for the driver to park directly in the courtyard, to drive in even though there wasn't a driveway, it was a walking path, and to walk with us all the way up to her door. And I brought plenty of cigarettes to bribe him. And just before nightfall, Polly and I started walking around. And by now it seemed like there were two tails on every block. And as we would cross the street, another two people would follow us. We decided to test it out. So we went into this museum, and Polly and I split up and went into different rooms. And so these tails split up and went into different rooms. And when we got back together, they followed us. We finally got tired of being followed, so we went outside. The museum was really overlooking the Black Sea. It was beautiful, and we sat down on a park bench. And so I was terrified, but Polly's way of dealing with fear was to pretend that there was nothing to be afraid of. So if I hadn't agreed to go to the Seder, Polly would have left me alone in the hotel room and gone on her own. And I was even more scared of being on my own than I was of being with Polly. So I forced myself to adapt with her, and we just didn't talk about what was going on. However, being followed so blatantly was disconcerting. So to give myself courage, I taught Polly a Native American round that I had learned in a singing group right before the trip. And so it goes like this. Strong as the wind, my people, and strong as the rain, strong as the sun does shine, we will raise our song again. So we sang that song over and over again, expecting the singing to distract us while also giving us strength and hope. Yet while we were sitting on the bench, a nice young couple came and sat down on the bench right opposite us, where they could hear everything we were saying. And after about 5 minutes, they got up, and another nice young couple came and sat down on the bench in the exact same spot. And then they got up, and another nice young couple came and sat down. This happened again and again. After about 5 young couples, it was clear that these were also KGB plants. And so Polly and I got up and started walking, and the couples faded in the distance, and some KGB men, this time wearing armbands, started visibly following us again. As I mentioned earlier, on each block, there were a different set of two men following us, and whenever we crossed the street, a new group would take over. It also seemed that on every few blocks, there was a white car waiting with people in it, and we just pretended not to notice the cars. I finally looked at my watch and noticed it was time to go to the Seder. So we flagged down a passing taxi, opened the door, and jumped in. I handed the driver Yehudit's address along with the written request to drive directly into the courtyard and park in front of her entryway. Off we went. The two guys who'd been following us jumped into the white car parked on that block that already had 3 people in it, and they began following our taxi. I turned around and looked, and sure enough, the white car had the license plate 2599. Our taxi driver liked the cigarettes and read my note, so he drove directly into the courtyard and parked. We got out of the taxi, and 7 men came out of the shadows and began walking towards us. The white car with the 5 men in it, the 3 men who'd already been there on our 2 tails, came out, and they also entered. They parked in the courtyard, and they came out. Polly and I simply linked arms with our driver and started climbing the steps to Yehudit's courtyard. The 12 KGB men came to the entrance of the building and stood there, but they did not follow us up the stairs and prevent us from going in. So we arrived at Yehudit's with no more incidents. I gave the cigarette packs to the driver, and Yehudit ushered us into her apartment. None of the guests had arrived yet, so we helped her set the table for the Seder. Yehudit explained that people often got hassled on their way to and from synagogue, so rather than coming as a group from the services, her guests were going to take different routes and arrive one by one. That way, if one person got beaten up, maybe the others would not. Eventually, everyone arrived and the Seder started. And here now I'm going to show you a picture of the Seder. So this is the Seder over here. This is Yehudit right here, and this is her father right there. I found it very emotional. During Passover, we talk about the exodus from Egypt, about Jews trying to get Pharaoh to let them go. And Polly and I were in a room of Jews whose only crime was asking to go to their homeland in Israel. And for that, their lives had dramatically changed. I realized how fortunate I was as an American Jew to be able to come and go to different countries as I wished, and to be able to talk in freedom and to walk in freedom. During the Seder, we talked, we sang, we answered questions. We obviously retold the story of the Exodus. And every once in a while, one of the men would go to the window, look in the courtyard, and count the KGB men out there. 9, 10, 11, 12. They were all still there. One of the high points of the evening was midnight when it started to rain, and we all rejoiced because the KGB men were out in the courtyard getting wet. The Seder ended in the wee hours of the morning, but Polly and I stayed longer to answer more questions by Yehudit and to teach her some songs. At about 8 a.m., the KGB men all left the courtyard. So at 9 a.m., Polly and I finally felt safe to leave to take a taxi and go back to our hotel. We were exhausted from staying up all night, so we fell immediately into a deep sleep. But a loud pounding on the door woke us up at about 11 o'clock. We were ordered to go downstairs to the office of the official government travel agency, Intourist, for an interview. The first thing the Intourist guide said to us was, "You broke hotel rules. Didn't you know there's a midnight curfew?" Polly decided to take the offensive rather than the defensive, and she indignantly replied, "That's ridiculous. Who ever heard of a hotel having a curfew?" Her response stunned the woman. She responded, "Well, since you didn't know about it, I'll let it go this time. But if you stay out past midnight again, I can't guarantee your lives. And if you do manage to return to the hotel safely, we'll send you back to the United States and never let you into the Soviet Union again." Going back to the US actually sounded good to me. But Polly seized upon the opportunity to complain about the fact that we'd been unable to get tickets to dance and music performances, and we're very disappointed. So the Intourist guide produced 2 tickets for us for a performance by Odessa artists in a concert hall for that evening, and dismissed us with another warning about staying out late. We went and visited Yehudit one more time on our last day in Odessa. She gave us a gift, a kosher Havdalah candle. Apparently, after the Miller's cheese had been eaten, Yehudit and her friend had melted the wax that was covering the cheese and fashioned a Havdalah candle out of it. And for those of you who don't know, Havdalah is a ceremony that we have on Saturday night to say goodbye to the Sabbath, and it's a candle with braided wax. She gave this candle to us, and she said it had meant so much for our visit that she wanted us to have it. So there were no more KGB encounters in Odessa, but my nerves were shot. So it was a relief then to go on to the next place. Here I have a little bit from my report, and I'll just say a bit. The group Jews in Odessa are really scared. They're terrified of the KGB men and the problems they encounter with being Jewish, but it's so important to them that they continue learning and gathering together anyway. Although they're afraid, they have such strong strength when they're together. Okay. Oh, no. Okay. So anyway, now we go to Vinnitsa. And this is what Polly wrote in our report as her introduction to Vinnitsa. "Not for weak hearts, dedicated to the KGB of Vinnitsa. May you be like a chandelier. You should burn by day, hang by day, and burn by night." So we arrived in Vinnitsa, and we were met by a man named Mr. Braverman. And he told us, he was our Vinnitsa tour guide, that he was Jewish himself, and we could go wherever we want and visit whoever we wanted. And we'd actually heard about him from other people who had gone there and said, don't trust him. Mr. Braverman took us to our hotel room and told us this when we were standing in front of a box on the wall that had wires going up and out the door, which was clearly a microphone. So On the first day, we decided we were going to go visit a Jewish family, and Polly and I had memorized those lists, but every time we got close to anyone's home, we were blocked by the police. We saw policemen nearby. And when we got to one apartment building, the policeman told us there was a shootout. And there were robbers in the building. There was going to be a shootout, and if we didn't leave immediately, we were going to be shot. So we started walking back to our hotel. And as we did, a white car pulled up and the door opened and some men came out and tried to push us into the car. Polly and I screamed really loudly. The men just climbed back in the car and sped away. And we went back to the hotel. We had been told not to call anybody, and there was one person in particular we wanted to meet. His name was Boris Dajkovic, because Beth Huppen from Brandeis had met him, and she had a relationship with him. She gave Polly this camera to give to him because she heard he was having a really hard time, and she wanted to give him the camera to sell, and we had his address, but we couldn't get anywhere near his house. So every time we went to visit someone in Vinica, we were stymied. So we finally gave up and just became tourists. We went to visit a downtown museum, and inside they had on exhibit a desecrated Torah scroll. On our final day in Vinica, just a few hours before departing by train to Vinica, Polly decided we should make a last-ditch effort to meet Boris. So she went into the phone booth outside of the hotel and called him. Boris was delighted to hear from us. She said we're Beth's friends, and he told us we should meet him in the marketplace downtown. It's like an outdoor market. We agreed. Polly and I began walking through the center of the town on our way to the market. But when we were right across the street from the museum we'd visited the day before, there were these two men with armbands blocking the sidewalk by linking their arms together. They just stood there, and then they tried to push us across the street. But I said, we already went to that museum yesterday. We haven't been there again today. It was really weird because it was in the middle of the day. It was right before noontime. Downtown Vinica was very crowded. There were tons of people walking by. Not one person offered to help us. I guess the men with the armbands were intimidating. Then they tried to push us back. They said, go hotel. And we said, oh, we're just out for a walk. We don't want to go to the hotel. And they tried to push us back. And one of the men, by mistake, hit a little too low, and he hit me on the breast. And so without thinking, I instinctively reacted and hit him and said, don't you dare punch me there. Don't you dare touch me there. And Polly saw what I was doing, and she liked it. So she started punching the guy in front of her. I guess it's got them a little bit embarrassed because they let go of us, and we realized we didn't want to get arrested, so we quickly turned around and went back to the hotel. We went to Mr. Braverman's office, and we played being indignant tourists. You told us we could go wherever we wanted, but these hooligans stopped us. Mr. Braverman assured us that being stopped like that was unusual, and he asked us to fill out a complaint form. We'd been warned in advance not to sign our names on anything, so we filled out the complaint form against the hooligans who blocked our way on the street, writing in very big letters with fake signatures on the bottom. Then we handed in the forms and went outside, and Polly, of course, realized that there was a trolley, and if we hopped on it, we'd still have time to go meet Boris at the market before our train to Vinica, to Kishinev. So we hopped on the trolley, went down to the market, and sure enough, we recognized Boris from the photograph. There he was waiting for us. He was wearing a dark blue jacket, and he had very sad eyes. The first thing he said was, my children are sick. Can you get them some medicine? And then he told us specifically what medicines were needed, and Polly wrote it down. We didn't have any medicine with us, and even if we had, I don't think we would have given it to him because then who knows what we could have been arrested for. But Polly promised she'd bring his message back to the U.S. and see what could be done. She then gave him the camera that Beth bought and said she should sell it and get money to support his family. He asked about Beth, but we'd not spend more than a few minutes with him when a car full of KGB men drove up to us. The men exited the car. They grabbed Boris by the back of his collar and pulled him backwards. Polly and I were aghast, and as we watched them pulling away from him after confiscating the camera, of course, we jumped on the trolley. But before we got on, Boris called out after us in a loud voice, when you get back to America, tell them what you saw. With no time to lose, Polly and I hopped back on the trolley and made it to the station in time to catch our train to Kishinev. For the entire journey, I saw Boris's face in front of me, his body being pulled away, and his words, when you get back to America, tell them what you saw. The rest of our trip had some scary moments, but nothing as powerful as those few precious minutes with Boris. By the time we got to Kishinev, we were so wiped out that we decided we weren't going to see anyone. We were just going to go out and visit the vineyards. And we went to a wine cellar where they plied us with lots of wine. We had more German tourists. And then the lady there said, "Oh, are you Jewish?" So we said yes. And she said, "Oh, are you going to go visit the synagogue?" Now, we hadn't planned on doing anything. But when she brought it up, we said, "Well, okay." So the next day we went to visit the synagogue and we met some people there. And then we went outside for a walk and we noticed in the park they had a statue honoring the hero Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who we know in Jewish history had led the Cossacks in massacres of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainian Orthodox Catholics. And yet he's being celebrated as a national hero. So it was just very interesting. Not much happened there. And then from there, we went on to, here's a family that we met. We did meet other families there. And this was a family, I don't even remember their names. They could not speak a word of English or Hebrew. We couldn't speak any Russian. But there was just this wonderful connection with them. And they were happy to see us and we were happy to see them. When we got to Leningrad, we had no problems whatsoever. This is a group of serious scholars who are studying the Talmud, and they were so amazed when Polly started talking about Talmud with them because she had actually studied with Danny Siegel. And then we met these three guys. This is Yosef, Volodya, and Sasha. There are three friends in Leningrad, and they have a sign advertising Hebrew lessons. Yosef was this really smart guy who was an engineer who lost his job when he applied to leave. He was now an elevator operator, but he had taught himself Hebrew, met with all these Jewish tourists who would come, and ran Hebrew classes himself. The three friends got together and bought this little car, which they named Susita. And so they gave Polly and I a tour of Leningrad in their car, Susita. And here's a picture. That's Polly over there. That's me hidden over there. And here they are in one of their Hebrew, that's me with the long hair. Here they are in one of their Hebrew classes. And this is just one more picture. I'm happy to say that Yosef was able to get out and make Aliyah. When Stuart and I were living in Israel, we were friends with him and his wife, and they ended up buying a nice high-rise hotel in Tel Aviv, a high-rise apartment in Tel Aviv. Anyway, we left Leningrad by flying over. We had to leave real early in the morning because the drawbridge goes up and you can't get to the airport otherwise. So we had a long time waiting in the airport, and we were really nervous that people might confiscate our cameras. Because another thing we did, as Polly met people, they would say, "I want to get an invitation from Israel, but I don't have any relatives." So they would write down their name and their address, and Polly would take a photograph of it, with our intention when we got back of developing the photos and then handing it to the guy who had funded us to go. But when we got back, Polly had her photos developed, and I guess it was a double exposure, but it's really kind of spooky. I don't know if you could see that the address was like superimposed on this picture that we had taken in one of the Russian parks. And then we have another two of one of those monuments with someone's name and address superimposed over it. Anyway, Polly and I sent our pictures to be made into slides, and I created this whole slideshow around our trip to the Soviet Union. And a lot of it was because I felt obligated to respond to Boris's request. And so I started looking for opportunities to present my slideshow. First, I started doing it with my friends, and then I started speaking at the university, and then Hadassah groups, and many Americans didn't know what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time, and so they were captivated by my story. At that time, they were passing in the American government something called the Jackson-Varick Amendment that was tying trading grain with letting Refuseniks out of Russia. And so I pushed people to sign this amendment, and a lot of people did. I told that story a lot, but then eventually, as you know, once Gorbachev got in power, things started getting better, and the Iron Curtain opened up. By the time I moved to Israel, almost all of the Refusenik families that I had visited had been let out. Although I have to say, in terms of my trips, a lot of other American Jews who came after us who wanted to go, when they met with their benefactors, were told Polly and my story as a cautionary tale, being told that they, if anything like that happens to them, they should lay low and not continue visiting people. And for Polly and I, we did not talk to each other for months after we got back to Boston. I was angry at her for putting us in harm's way and forging ahead, and she was mad at me for being such a wimp and always wanting to talk about how scared I was. But we finally reconciled over ice cream at Ben and Jerry's, and we're still close friends to this day. So Yehudit is also made Aliyah. She's living in Israel now. Um, she married a teacher that someone else I had met in Israel. And when she gave birth to her first child, Stuart and I attended her bris, the bris, and Boris was there. So he was with his children, smiling broadly. So it was really great to know that I had played a small part in getting them the medicine that they needed by passing on the information to someone who then passed it on to somebody else. So I'm telling you this story now because so much has happened in the world since then. And having experienced firsthand what happens when there's a total disregard. Now, again, Polly and I were treated well because we were American citizens. I wasn't actually thrown into jail. I wasn't actually hit, but I saw what was happened to other people. It is a personal story, and of course, it's skewed by what was seen through my eyes. However, it is a true story, and only by learning about injustice and seeing examples of what a really bad government will do will help people understand what other people are capable of. And I think right now it's really important to be very vigilant about preventing something massively horrible like that happening again. And when we have people in the government who promote lies and who think that their way of thinking is the only right way, and people who don't think right are wrong, and who call people with different opinions liars, then I find that incredibly frightening. So I'm grateful that I've been given the gift of gab, the ability to weave stories together from personal experiences. And so I thought it was time to renew my vow to Boris that I would tell them what you saw. And so I put up on Facebook that I was going to be doing this talk. And I said, if anyone wants to come, please give me your information and I'll send it a link to you. So thank you everyone for coming. And now if you're interested, I'm happy to open up for any questions.
Have you spoken at any schools?
I spoke at Cardin once. Hold on, I'm trying to, I did something with my video. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, I spoke at the Cardin School once, but I haven't really spoken. When I first came here, I guess I didn't realize about age appropriateness, and I was invited to do a program at the Jewish Museum for preschoolers, and I started talking about my trip, which is really inappropriate. And then I kind of got scared of talking about it again. And again, at that point, people were being let out of the Soviet Union, so it didn't seem like I needed to talk about it anymore. But now nobody knows. A lot, the younger people don't know about this part of our history. So if
Betsy,
anybody wants me to tell the story, I'm very happy to tell it again. I wrote down a lot of prompts so I can retell it in almost the same way. Yeah, Jennifer.
Betsy, oh my gosh, you know I want to give you, before a question, appreciation. This is just so, you're such a gifted teller, and this, uh, the content of what you're teaching us, I've heard this probably 3 times over the past, 18 years or so, and I never get tired of hearing it. I always kind of remember what you told us, and I feel it. I mean, I actually feel it in a way that no lecture, no kind of essay can tell us, as someone who is an American Jewish woman like myself, who took this risk, to go there. And that you didn't make it at all like you were a hero, even though you were. You shared with us your fear and what all these people are going through. And I just felt like each person we were meeting, and when you shared at the end about Boris being there with Yehudit and her husband and child, I mean, there was like such a redemptive feeling in knowing that you were part of that, and us knowing you, like, kind of makes us feel part of this. This must be taught to high schoolers and college students and adults, because we can't have the generation, in their 20s and 30s who really don't know about this, not know about it, because they're going to be the ones when they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s telling the next generation. So
Well, I don't think it's only a Jewish story. I think it's a
That too.
universal story.
I agree, but I think Jewish people, all Americans and Jews, really everybody needs to hear it, but in the Jewish community in particular. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, I'm happy to tell it if anybody wants to get together a group of people who want to hear it. Now that I have my notes. Anyone else have comments or questions? Yeah,
Betsy. So unlike Jennifer, this is the first time that I'm hearing this, and I have to say I was on the edge of my seat for most of your talk. I strongly believe that this should be told, as much as you can. But I do have a question. Did you ever at any point think of going back to Russia again?
No. For me, it was interesting. We had a long train ride, and I was looking out the window, and the Russian countryside is so beautiful. This rich, fertile land, this dark soil. And again, part of my family comes from Russia. So I felt this sense of connection in that way. But I was more frightened than I've ever been in my life, and I don't think I could ever go back. Oh, in fact, Stuart at one point, but when we lived in Israel, he was applying for a job to be a shaliach in Russia, and I did agree to go back, but I was really hoping he wouldn't get the job, and he didn't get it.
Have you had opportunities to speak with other people who did the same thing as you?
Yes. In fact, my lovely husband did the same thing, and he has his own story, which he can tell you. I wanted this to be just me this time. And has anyone else, Lori, did you go, or did anyone else on here go?
No,
Jeff and I was
me.
Hold on. Elise, what did you say?
I said no, but Judy Rodenstein, who's on, and I had a roommate, Ruthie Doctor, who went probably in 78, I'm thinking. And their stories were very similar to yours. Lots of fear, lots of KGB following them. They talked about putting hairs and things in the door frames of their hotel doors so they could tell if people had entered when they weren't there. They were followed, they were threatened. They had very, very, very similar stories to yours, although I haven't heard those stories in 30 years. Kol hakavod for telling this again, and I can think of people in my community who might be interested in hearing this. And my mom is sitting next to me. She's in New Jersey in an elder community, and she was thinking this could be really interesting.
A wonderful program.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and Judy's mother went, right, Judy?
Yeah, I apologize for the background noise. It's my computer that's noisy right now. But my mom went on a similar trip. She was with a slightly larger group with people. I don't remember the chronology, whether it was before you went or more likely after you went. But they also brought jeans to leave with people so they could sell it to help support their families. And she had very similar stories. And one of the most vivid things in her stories is the woman who sat on each floor of the hotel and they had to check in with and leave their passports with, which was scary, the same detail.
Yep. And one thing that was interesting, all homes of Refuseniks had etch-a-sketches. So like Polly and I had brought these watercolor markers, but they were smarter. They had an etch-a-sketch so they could write what they wanted to say and then just erase it. So we were able to come back and tell people, bring some etch-a-sketches with you.
Now,
Lori?
if Jeff and I had gone, we were supposed to go as a couple.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know who was before us, but had been like Elise was saying about leaving things on the door, but these people had been beaten up, like really, not just like you said about just pushing around. And they said it was too dangerous to send any more going, which was very sad. But only about a year ago, Jeff and I were doing a program with a number of young Russian adults, as my kids used to call them, new Americans, when they were in day school. And at one point, I remember the kids being in 2nd or 3rd grade, and they wanted to know, when does a new American become an old American? Like, when do Russian citizens become ours? We said to this group of Russians in their 20s, we started talking about wearing the bracelets, and in fact, being in Israel to give back some of the bracelets to some of the Refuseniks who made it out while we were in Israel. And they, as young Russians, had no concept that a time had taken place within their own personal family history that you couldn't come back and forth. You couldn't just leave when you wanted.
Wow.
So that kind of story isn't just for us. I think there's an entire community of
protest on the Washington Mall.
Oh, the Soviet Jewry protest on the Washington Mall, Jeff was reminding me. But one time when we lived in Milwaukee, which would have been back in 1985, Mom used to come to me for Purim. So it's appropriate for this time of year. And my mother and I would bake and bake and bake. And so we could get all of these mishloach manot. And I said to her, we have so many new Russian immigrants. Let's go to that side of town and we'll find them. I mean, how hard is it to find them? And we got into a building, and the elevator was like the size of like a one toilet in Israel. It was like really 4 people. And we got in, and there was this very tall, thin, older man, clearly looked Russian. And I turned to him and said, as the door closed, "Are you Jewish? Are you a Jew?" I thought the man was going to just try. He did his best to like try to disappear right there in that moment, because the pachad, the fear that we might have identified him. And so I pushed to get off on the next floor and grabbed my mother, handed him a mishloach manot, and I said to him, "Chag Sameach." But I thought here I had done the worst possible thing. He thought he had been found out. And it wasn't even like he was in danger in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So, but thank you for bringing us all together and for sharing that time of your life.
Well,
So
so
we
nice
want
to
to
see
know
people
when
from
Sue
all
is
over.
ready. That's right. All different connections in your life. I love
Yep.
it.
Yep.
Love
Yep.
Betsy, I wanted to also say that before her trip, my mother was a Soviet Jewry activist in New Jersey, and afterwards, she worked for a long time as a vocational counselor, getting Russians who were able to immigrate to America jobs and help them get started in the United States. So it was it's a really big part of her life.
Well, I think I recorded this. I hope I did. So, yeah. Okay. So then, if anybody wants a copy of it, I can send it to you also.
Betsy, I just want to say one more thing. I have to go,
Yeah.
but I definitely encourage you to, the new CAGE Jewish Educator Conference that I go to most summers. It actually was supposed to be in Baltimore last year and then again this year, and it's going to be online both. But regardless if it's in Baltimore in the next few years in person or just the online version, we had about 800 people last summer. They pick all different sessions at the same time. But if 20 or 30 Jewish educators from around the U.S. came and heard you, those are people, they could even make it part of the college cohorts program. I think you'd be great for that in addition to the general Jewish educators, because then there's people who are going into Jewish education, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who would be hearing this. I just think there's so much need for this at this conference, a story like this. So let's talk about that too.
Okay. So
Yeah,
let's talk
perfect.
about that. You could send me information.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. This was amazing. I'm honored to be here.
I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer just to say hi to people.
Thank you, Betsy. This was fantastic. I remember when you and Polly went. So
Wait, who's talking? I don't see a face.
it's Helene.
Oh, hi, Helene. Yeah.
And Beth.
Where'd you go? There you are.
Nakama and that whole Brandeis. There was a whole group of you.
Yeah, Nate Geller was going to come today, but then he couldn't come on. But I think he went also. Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm so glad you came. It's, you know, who knows? You put out a notice on Facebook and look what happens.
Well, thank you so
Um,
much.
My
Betsy,
pleasure.
I'm sorry I have to go, Betsy, but we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Take care, IA.
Okay, bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Betsy.
My pleasure. Good to see you,
Thank you,
Linda.
Betsy.
Bye, Judy. Good to see you.
Betsy,
Hi,
since
Elise. Thanks for coming.
Since I missed most of the presentation, if it's possible to hear the recording, I'd love to be able to see it.
Okay, I'll send it to you. And if I end up doing it again, I'll let you know. Thanks, Tom.
Actually,
How are you doing in Texas now?
doing fine, but the other group I was thinking of is not educators, but I'm involved with a twice a month Zoom with Holocaust survivors. It's mainly a means to keep them together, and so we've been having programs. Also, it's not necessarily Holocaust related. It's a lot of times different things. Like we're going to have one about Judaic art of Pesach, and synagogues around the world and that kind of thing. So the people who are programming it have done a lot of the calendar for the next few months, but I think we're going to be doing Zoom things for a long time.
All right. Well, feel
Especially
free
that
to
population.
tell
So
them.
I'm gonna tell them about it, because this is one that some of the survivors that were in this country already were involved with, and certainly has an affinity for what happened with Soviet Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Toby. Giving me another opportunity. That would be great.
Hey, Betsy, how are you?
Good. How are you, Gary?
Good. I was a little late. I'm sorry, but this was really good. This was, I wish I could have been there for like the first 10, 15 minutes. But thank
Well,
you
I'm
for
glad
sharing.
you're
I'm glad.
here.
Yeah, I'm glad I caught it on Facebook so I could join you guys.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi,
My pleasure.
Stuart.
Thank you for coming.
No.
He has two screens, and the screen that he's looking at is not the one that has the camera. So
Yeah, no, I have two screens.
it
I've
looks
got
like he's
going
not
on
paying
right now.
attention.
Nah, don't worry about it. Take care.
Take care. Bye, Gary. And
So just
still, I
smile
haven't.
at us, Stuart.
Say again?
Just smile at us so we can see your charming face.
Look at the camera on the laptop.
Ah.
There you go. He's my co-host. Hey, Jeff.
I would like to
Great story.
the recording too, if you can send it to me.
Okay, send me an email, and once I get the recording, I'll be very happy to send it over to you. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks for staying up so late.
My pleasure. It's great always pleasure to listen to you talk.
Thanks. Thank you.
You.
Woo!
So,
hey, Betsy. So I actually had a question real quick.
Yeah?
How long were you over there? I know you probably said at the beginning, but I might have missed it.
3.5 very long weeks.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it seemed like it was an eternity to me.
Were you able to get in contact with all of the families that you had originally set out to meet with?
Not in Vinica. In Vinica, we only met Boris.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad that you were able to meet him.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
thank you for this presentation, Betsy. It was awesome. I loved it.
Oh, I'm glad you got to hear it. A cool opportunity. I was very glad that you responded to my notice on Facebook. Thanks, Nichelle.
It's anytime, Betsy. Anytime.
Take care. Mwah.
All my love to you guys. See you.
To you too. Bye.
Betsy, there's got to be a way. We need to partner with education to get this out.
What do you think?
I'm listening to this, and I remember thinking, I don't remember learning about the Soviet Union at all in high school. I took one class in Russian history in college, and that was it. I've learned so much else by my own learning, but I don't remember, by the same token, I didn't learn about the Korean War either. And, Jen and I are both historians. We talk about this all the time, the fact that we're losing a lot of history. And I'm sure you heard the thing that came out last year that said, only 25% of Gen Xers know what the Holocaust is? Or was it 45%? Yeah. It was a disgusting number.
Really, that's surprising, because most schools, I thought, have mandated Holocaust studies. I mean,
Oregon only became mandated 5 years ago.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Because my kids who are in their 20s, well,
they're in college now.
But you live in New Jersey.
That's what I'm saying. I know. So
Yeah.
New Jersey, for sure, it's been mandated for a long time.
I
don't
grew up
know
in
about the rest of the country.
Yeah, I grew up in Arizona and we touched on it and it sparked my interest. So we touched on it in middle school and then a little bit in high school. And so I went from there, but we didn't touch on it at all. And I talked to my brother who was 8 years younger than me, and he never talked about it at all. He was never taught it.
Uh-huh.
I don't think it's mandated in Arizona.
Oh, see,
But you're also
I
talking
thought it
about a
was-
state.
That's interesting because I thought it was a national mandate. I didn't realize that it's just a state mandate.
No, you're talking about a state that tried to restrict the teaching of Native American and Latino descent history.
Wow.
I was wondering if I put a message like the one I put on Facebook on a library listserv.
I think
Do
you
you think?
could.
But I think
Definitely try it.
because it says Jewish Refuseniks, I wonder if people aren't Jewish will look at that and then say, you know, it's not for me.
But why don't you just write Refuseniks? You don't have to write Jewish.
Right.
Because really, they just call themselves Refuseniks.
Yeah, that's
Never
true.
put Jewish, and then see what that sparks.
Yeah.
The other thing is I was trying to say, I didn't realize my mic wasn't on. That's what I was trying to tell before. I think you should talk to Hillel International, because that age people should be hearing this. I was going to ask for the recording to send to my kids. Also, I've gone to some programs at MIT Hillel for alumni recently, and
Wait, as long as there are just 6 of us, let me introduce everyone. This is
Yeah.
Estelle. That's Estelle talking, and Estelle is in New Jersey. That's Toby next to her. Toby's in Texas. Then we have Shari with the long hair in Israel. There's my husband, Stuart, and above him is Melanie, who's a dear, dear friend and fellow librarian who used to live in Baltimore, but is now living out in Oregon.
Oh, wow.
You're all dear, dear friends.
I figured. And the other thing is I have a friend whose husband is the head of Clark Hillel. So I have, contacts those 2 places. If you want to just feel the waters, I could contact them and ask if they're interested.
I'm not very good at selling myself. And so if you could make the contact for me, that would be fabulous.
No,
And it sounds kind of weird, but any chance they give an honorarium for doing this?
Usually they do for things like this. For sure.
Okay. Just because, times are,
of course.
Yes, they're tough.
No, so then the other thing that I was going to say though is I remember when you did that, when you gave this talk in Boston.
Oh, right. Yeah. And I think I did it at MIT.
Was it? I don't remember where. When you were doing it, I said, oh yeah, I remember. I heard all of this. It was great, but it was really nice to hear it again. But what's really funny is many years later, I went to a conference in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad.
Right.
But this was, when it was very safe to go there, but I was still, because of everything you had said, I was a little nervous going in, and it was during Sukkot. So I had a lulav with me and it was out. I mean, I was coming from Israel. And when I got to passport control to go in, they're looking at my passport. And they say, hold on, and they take the passport away and they tell me to stand on the hot side somewhere. And I was really freaking out because of all your stories. And I'm holding this lulav. And then they came back. It turns out that another professor from Ben Gurion University, who was also going to the same conference, the same travel agent had arranged all 3 of our visas. And his wife came as well. It was him, his wife, and me. And somehow they made a mistake. They put my visa in the wife's passport and the wife's visa in my passport. And they were sort of waiting, and we weren't on the same flight. So they were kind of waiting for me to get there so that they could fix up the visas. But this whole thing, it was, it really scared me because of your stories. It was fun.
Uh-oh. Sorry.
Okay. And then the other thing that was really nice, though, is that I was there through Simchat Torah. and I went to the main synagogue in St. Petersburg, and just to talk about totally different situation. There were hundreds of people dancing in the streets, and Jews, dancing in the streets and singing and dancing with the Torah. It was just really pretty amazing. So,
yeah. When we actually went to the synagogue in Moscow for a Saturday morning, and there were very few people there. There seemed to be, we were afraid it might be KGB agents, so we didn't talk to anyone. Later on, we found out everybody meets outside. They don't go inside. All the young people hang out outside, but we didn't know, so you learn. Yeah.
There's got to be a way to also offer this to professors who teach Russian history, or if there's classes that focus on the Iron Curtain during that time. I mean, I think that would be...
yeah, that would be very interesting.
Yeah. I don't have any context for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me neither,
is 3 foot and shorter.
Well, it feels good. Stuart and I have been going to this synagogue, B'nai Jeshurun in New York City, which we love. Now that, you can't go to shul on your own, and they were having this Adult Ed thing. So we together told both of our stories, compacted into half an hour. And that kind of made me thirsty to tell my full story. And just to see if people wanted to hear it. So you guys are making me feel really good about my decision.
And also talking about university professors, do you know Renee Marlin?
Yeah.
Talk to her, because she teaches poli-sci at Johns Hopkins. So she probably knows people in the history department. And she would just be a good person to talk to about this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jen might also know some people.
Yeah. Okay.
And when you talk to her, say hi.
I will.
We were both at Israeli folk dancing last night. Ruthie Goodman and Danny.
Uziel?
Well, Danny Uziel was sort of there making commentary, but the other Danny, who
send me a link. I'll come sometime.
I'll send you the link. So what happened was, once a month they do a Saturday night kind of oldies party. Well, they call it Saturday night dance party. They do a lot of old dances, which is really nice. Joe and I danced from 8 till 11, and I haven't been dancing, except for a little bit here and there. I haven't been dancing hardly at all. I was in such pain this morning when I woke up.
I've gone on a number of the Zoom
Renee was
dancing.
there. Say that again.
I said I've done a number of the Zoom dancings. Our group in Texas is now doing every week on Zoom.
Oh,
but I've done Chicago, and I did with Ruth Goodman once, and I forgot about it last night because I wanted to.
You got to get on her list, because that's how we knew, because she said so. The next one is it's the third Saturday in March. It's like March, Saturday, a whole week before Pesach.
Right. Yeah, I got.
I'm writing it on my calendar now.
I'll send you the
email.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. I went to Shmulik Avariz once. He does it too.
Oh, and then I don't know. Shari invited me to something that Murray Spiegel was at, and he invited me for there was a solar.
That's my ex-husband, Melody.
So Betsy, there was a solar eclipse.
Oh, I went to that. Larry was in charge of that.
Yeah, Larry was in charge of it. So Murray said, "Oh, you got to go to this thing." So I went. That I was just kind of sitting in front of the computer watching it. But this, we rolled up the rug in the living room, and Joe and I were really dancing. It was really nice.
Yeah, Stuart's not really into folk dancing.
No.
It's funny because he's a great dancer. Like, he just knows how to move his body instinctively to dances. But when it comes to prescribed steps, he can't remember the steps, and then he gets frustrated. So it's hard because he's such a great dancer, but he can't be my folk dance partner.
Oh, speaking of which, on a totally different topic, Stuart, did I see something about you doing bike riding? Long distance bike riding by you?
Betsy and I did it in Israel. I did the Israel bike ride from Jerusalem to
That's
Eilat.
what I thought. Yeah,
I
yeah,
did
yeah.
it 4 times.
I
Four
did it
times?
once.
Wow. No, because Joe and I got really serious about bike riding again this summer. Well, starting last spring. And we stopped about a month ago because the weather got so crazy here. But when all this calms down, I got into this thing. I'd like to come and do some bike riding in your area. So if you're game to do some bike
Let
riding.
us know. We have our, there's a nice trail around the BWI airport. It's about 12 miles. And we'd love to do that. So any of you, you're all invited to come to the Baltimore area and go bike riding with us.
Yeah, we've been training for the Arava Institute bike ride.
Yeah, someday I would love to do
Well,
that.
we had been. We haven't been doing any biking for quite a while because of the weather.
Yes.
You know, snow and ice is not the best time to go bike riding.
Nope.
Uh,
Do you
I keep
still
thinking.
have?
You're gonna go, Mel?
No, I was going to say I keep thinking that I want to come out and see Steph and you, and I can't. I get on the thing to make reservations to get on a plane, and then it's got this big COVID warning, and I went, "Ay."
So the good news is Stuart and I got our first vaccine.
Oh, great. Joe got his
And
first vaccine.
we're getting our second one in 2 weeks.
Nice.
And we found out about it because Alone's wife called us up and said, there's a link to the Maryland Fairground, sign up right away. And we did. And they accepted me. So
Wow, that's great.
even though I'm a year and a half too young, but because I'm obese, they accepted me. So it's a good thing for being overweight. And so now we have plane tickets to go to Nashville, and I'm going to get to finally meet my grandson in person for Passover.
Wow.
Yay. Oh, enjoy that.
Yeah. Can't believe I have a grandson.
Wow, mazel tov. I didn't know.
Thank you. Yeah, Toby's an old hat already with that, but it's
I
very
got my
exciting.
vaccine though in a very random kind of way. I was we had this big ice storm that y'all probably saw in Texas because of all the ridiculous power outages and stuff as a result. So it closed the state for most of a week. And there was a lot of vaccines that didn't get delivered. There was vaccination sites that were canceled, and there was a freezer that went out in the medical center. So I got an email from the Orthodox synagogue because I'd made a donation.
I
there.
read an article about that. You're
So
one of the people. That's amazing.
So the first day I got this email, I was unfortunately watching, I had a young cousin that died and I was watching the funeral. So I didn't want to go out right then because I really wanted to be there with the family. So when it finished like 11:30, I was like, should I go? Should I not? Well, the roads were icy, so I didn't want to take the chance on driving. So I walked over there. It was about 20, 30 minutes. And we were in the cold for another hour. And then they said, we don't have any more. So went home. And then the next day I got a text from a friend who said they've got 178 doses. So I went over right away and got in line. And then they said, we have 220, not 178. So everybody, it looks good. I got there about an hour before it opened. I was number 204 and my son was 206.
Wow.